And welcome back to your afternoon 5-State Farm Report. Danielle Drotzman, your host here for 570 WNAX. Thanks for tuning in here today on this Tuesday. Want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, DeSmet Farm Mutual Insurance, Fordyce Co-op, and Total Auctions and Real Estate for bringing you the afternoon 5-State Farm Report. Well, as we continue throughout your program here today, we are still in the month of June. It's crazy. We're basically at the end of June, but still in the month of June. So June is still dairy month. So just checking in with our dairy groups here around the U.S. So visiting here today with Alan Bjerga, Executive Vice President of Communications and Industry Relations with the National Milk Producers Federation. And thank you for joining us here today on WNAX.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, you know, when you kind of look at the dairy industry as a whole, I know you guys probably get a lot of feedback there. So how do you feel things are right now within the industry from, I know, maybe like a policy side? Do you think, are people pretty optimistic? Are they good? Do the dairy producers kind of feel challenged? I guess maybe what are you hearing there?
So the National Milk Producers Federation, just to back up, is the representatives of dairy producers and the cooperatives they own in Washington, D.C. So we're dealing with a lot of federal policy. Of course, that federal policy takes place against the backdrop of how the dairy industry is doing and how the dairy economy is doing. And what we're seeing right now is an industry that is very much in expansion mode. You see an $11 billion amount of investment in new plant capacity. You know, the I-29 corridor, which I know is of great interest to folks in South Dakota, you know, that's been an area where we're seeing a lot of growth from the top to the bottom. A lot of larger dairy herds are going in. Milk production is up. That's often, frankly, a recipe for a price collapse. And prices have been challenging for several months, but honestly, the price outlook seems to be recovering somewhat. And that really goes to the potential of U.S. milk to be absorbed into the domestic and world supply. You know, demand is high. That indicates a bright future, the fact that we've had a price situation that recently has been improving and actually can improve further. At the same time, you have all this new capacity come along. It just shows that this is a growth industry. We have a growth mindset. That doesn't mean everything is great for every dairy farmer. I mean, far be it. It's a challenging business. But overall, there's a lot of reasons to be excited about the future of milk in the United States right now.
Absolutely. And I know, you know, creating markets always just kind of seems to be top of mind for all ag groups too, and just creating opportunity for the product is important. So, I mean, you kind of touched on domestic demand right there a little bit, but anything you're working on from the National Milk Producers Federation standpoint to improve domestic demand?
Well, you know, one of the things that you don't really think of it as a way of improving demand. We think of it more as better nutrition for school children. But, of course, the passage of the Whole Milk for Healthy Kids Act in Congress earlier this year should be leading to whole milk in school systems, you know, for the upcoming school year. This isn't necessarily something that is a huge increase in domestic demand, right? We would expect school children to be drinking more milk in schools because now they can have the access to the whole and 2% that they mainly drink at home. But what that's really interestingly about is the next generation of milk drinkers, right? As an industry, you're going to believe that the best quality product is what's going to attract the most consumers. And whole and 2% have qualities that school kids really like. So we're hoping that actually is going to be a long-term bump in domestic demand. In the meantime, you know, dairy does very well in demand for protein. And research shows that there's actually more room for us to grow as a protein source for people. You know, it's not just the powders that you see in an energy drink. It's milk as a recovery drink. It's cottage cheese for people who are on GLP-1 diets. You know, they're using Ozempic and they need a lot of nutrition in their lessened appetite. And dairy does a really good job on that. So, you know, looking at some of those possibilities, working at the next generation, those are some real things that we're doing on the domestic side. You know, you bring up international trade. The U.S. has been an increasing user of global markets and increasing exporter in recent years. It's really become a major source of demand for U.S. dairy products. This year, we are now set to be renewing the USMCA trade agreement. Canada and Mexico are major trading partners for U.S. dairy. With Mexico, it's about maintaining a really positive relationship. With Canada, frankly, it's about making sure that the agreement is strong enough that we can enforce some of the things that the Canadians agreed to that maybe the Canadians aren't doing so well in practice. It's really important for dairy to have stronger provisions provisions in a renegotiated USMCA. But keep in mind, one thing that we also really want is a USMCA. It's the rules of the road for dairy trade with two very important partners. We think large portions of it work pretty well. We just want to see it stronger. We want to see it reviewed effectively, and then we want to see it renewed.
Absolutely. Yeah, the USMCA is definitely a very important trade agreement, I guess, for all ag products. So, I mean, when it comes to trade, have you guys, I know there was a lot of concerns just around HPAI, and now we kind of have screwworm popping up too. So, I mean, are those issues that you foresee maybe would, affect trade at all, or are they just things you're keeping tabs on as an organization?
We're just not seeing that impact on trade. HPAI never really made that much of a difference with our trade. You do see things like, you see countries considering prohibiting cattle from Texas, for example. They'll do their limits by state, but a lot of that just ends up reorienting your supply chain. You can just get those animals from a different state, and then the state that's banned, maybe more of that goes into the domestic market. It doesn't really affect aggregate numbers in any meaningful way. One thing to keep in mind with New World screwworm is that this is a very, very serious issue for domestic producers in that area. It's heartbreaking to see what happens to the animals. It can be very burdensome to the producer as well. But in terms of trade, Argentina has been dealing with this for decades, and they are a major beef exporter. Screwworm is not something that has been a big trade barrier because it has affected a lot of countries. So in the United States, we're supporting all efforts we can have to relieve producers who are struggling with this and to assist them in this fight and to make sure that this gets pushed back south of the border and then even further south than that. But I don't see this as a major disruptor to trade because it's not new. It's not something that makes your meat unsafe. It's just something that is really hard for a producer who's trying to care for their animals and make sure that their animals get to market.
All right. And again, I had a nice long interview with him, so we'll maybe hear more from that conversation a little bit later here this week. And again, that's Alan Bjerga, Executive Vice President of Communications and Industry Relations with the National Milk Producers Federation. We'll take a quick break. We'll take a look at some local weather, and then we'll round out your hour here today with some cash grain numbers. So make sure to stay tuned to 570 WNAX. I'm Danielle Drotzman.